what we got here is failure to communicate, a chronic neglect of military mental health care. This is Psychiatric Casualties, how and why the military ignores the full cost of war.
Welcome, everyone. We're glad that you're back. And if you haven't listened to the other episodes, hopefully you will do that. So they've done a lot of great work in structuring this.
Yeah, they really have.
Yeah.
But for folks who might be tuning in for the first time, I'm Mark Russell, and this is my colleague and brother in arms, Charles Figley. And we're very glad that you came and decided to spend some time with us to talk about military mental health care.
Yeah, and the way we're doing this is we publish this book, and what we're doing is going each chapter, we are recording our discussion, critique, reactions to aspects of those particular chapters. And we've already gone through the beginning of the book and who we are, etc., in the first issue. And then the second version, the second episode, I guess, we talked about chapter 1 and had to really be selective at what we were going to talk about. But we did that. And this particular chapter is also quite long, not the next chapter, but this particular chapter.
Right.
So it's a bit of a challenge in that regard. But yeah, we try to pull out things that are interesting.
Yeah, well, exactly. And it just to kind of frame the issue that we're in trying to talk about this in an hour or 2 hours is that we're basically what we've done in this chapter 2 is we outline what is a mental health crisis in the military, and especially during wartime. And we provide ample evidence and documentation of the broad spectrum of conditions that human beings may manifest when they are exposed to neurotoxic environments like battlefields and war stress. And it's very comprehensive. And so, I had the same issue, Charles, just selecting out what parts to even talk about, because there's so much information, there's so much statistical data that is not present anywhere else, really. And so I'm very proud of this chapter and what it took to kind of knit together all the different aspects that really go into a mental health catastrophe we experience after every major war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is challenging because I think we've done an unbelievable job of being comprehensive. And although, we have thought about the possibility of writing a book focusing on other countries, and certainly we have examples that we used, but haven't done that yet.
In the future.
Yes, in the future. So one of the things I just want to start out, there was a couple of quotes that you will find. Yeah, this is the beginning of the chapter 2. A single finding underpinning all others is the military health system lacks the fiscal resources and fully trained personnel to fulfill its mission to support psychological health in peacetime or fulfill its enhanced requirements imposed during the time of specific conflict. Now, that's pretty bad in terms of this is the assessment by the DoD.
And Charles, if I can, that quote is coming from the Department of Defense congressionally mandated task force on mental health. And when they released their findings at their year-long study of military mental health care in 2007. So by this time, the war had been going on for almost 7 years. And this is the underlying conclusion, is that what you just read, but we couldn't provide enough for peacetime, let alone during the time of war, as far as mental health goes.
So then the next quote, in effect, talks about specifically post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right.
PTSD management in the DoD appears to be local, ad hoc, incremental, and in our view, the worst, crisis driven, with little planning devoted to development of long-range population-based approach for this disorder by either the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense, who's responsible for that, or any other service branch, really.
Right.
And Mark, what is your reaction to these quotes that I read
Right.
in terms of all that we've talked about
Yeah.
so far? I mean, they
Oh,
admit up front, here it is, we
right.
suck.
Well, yeah, I mean, my reaction is my typical reaction is one of outrage, really. I mean, the second quote about the PTSD management being local, ad hoc, incremental, and crisis driven, little planning, basically ineffective PTSD resources in the military is from
Institute of Medicine.
Institutes of Medicine study that was done on, I think, 2014, 2015. So about 7 to 8 years after the 2007 DoD task force put out this urgent plea to beef up military mental health care in the midst of a major mental health crisis. We're finding out that these programs are just so fragmented. They're under-resourced. There's no accountability for military mental health care. And that's what the Institutes of Medicine is saying, is that essentially nothing's really changed from that initial report in 2007.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and that's what we wrote the book about. This is why we wrote the book, because so many things fall through the cracks, especially with regard to mental health.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is, I'm nerdy enough. I went and counted how many actual studies has the government and the military, part of that government, have funded in regards to military mental health care since the post 9/11, era. And it's 214 separate studies have been conducted on every aspect of military mental health care. And the findings are pretty much what they keep repeating themselves, and they keep repeating the same recommendations study after study, and no one ever has done a study about why hasn't this been fixed yet. And we're spending millions of dollars on the studies that no one apparently has enough belief in to implement the recommendations, to follow through on it. And yet we're still stuck. And here we are in 2024. And dare say that, and from my perspective, and I still have a thumb on what's going on in the military in far as mental health, that nothing's really fundamentally changed.
Mike, this might be a good time to share what you've been doing most recently in your career with regard to the medical evaluations.
Well, yeah, so I
We're
work.
not talk about names, but
No, of course not. I do VA disability examinations for people coming out of the military, or veterans who have been out of the military, who are, requesting some type of a claim for a mental health condition. So I'm doing these evaluations, and I'm seeing people coming out of all the branches of service. And so that's what I mean by having a finger about what's going on in mental health care. I'm reviewing all these records, their service treatment records, and I can see what has and hasn't been done. And it's the same stuff that I saw when I was on active duty as a Navy psychologist. So yeah, that's the outrageous part, is that things haven't really changed. And as everything we're talking about in this book that we publish is not old antiquated information. It is current real life stuff that's going to affect future generations as well, unfortunately.
mm-hmm.
I wanted just to kind of, for me, what kind of a couple of points as we get into this chapter I wanted to make. One is that in the first 1 or 2 episodes, we talked about uncovering what we call the 10 fundamental war trauma lessons that every generation has documented, and every subsequent generation has neglected and has to relearn it. And one of the first that we'll be covering today is the first fundamental lesson, or psychiatric lesson of war, is that war inevitably causes a legitimate spectrum of war stress injury. And that spectrum That's not just our opinion. I mean, I'm looking at a top secret classified investigation by the U.S. Army during the Second World War. And this is what those Army researchers concluded. It has long been known that war neuroses do not constitute a clinical entity with characteristic and invariable symptoms. Instead, there is a wide variety of syndromes, the symptoms of which vary greatly. And if I had to summarize this chapter in a nutshell, that particular quote really encapsulates it. Essentially, there are three broad classifications of war stress injury and how it's manifested in human beings. And the first would be kind of what most people think of. We think of psychiatric conditions or neuropsychiatric conditions, as it's been called before. These are things like PTSD, depression, etc. And the single most commonly overlooked aspect of this spectrum is what are today referred to as medically unexplained physical symptoms, what have been called in the past war syndromes, or even more recent past psychosomatic or somatic kinds of or bodily physical manifestations of stress. So that's the second broad classification. And the third is you would kind of call it a more of a social behavioral manifestations of how people behave and experience. And that would include a moral dimension. So we talk about things like moral injury, but issues around homelessness, incarceration, what are called misconduct stress behaviors by the Army, suicide, interpersonal violence, all those are the kind of behavioral, if you would, manifestations of stress. So when you tie in all three of these categories together, you start to knit together the full kind of spectrum, if you would, of what it means to have a mental health crisis. And as we go into this a little bit more, we'll see just how broad and expansive that is and how wise that previously classified analysis was. Is that it's not a single entity. It's far more than PTSD. It's far more than PTSD and TBI. It's far more than suicide. It's all those and a lot more that constitute a mental health crisis. And that's what happens when we ignore these fundamental lessons of war.
Yeah, I think that when I was in Vietnam, much of the anxiety was not necessarily getting killed. It was made fools of, snuck up on, that kind of thing. But it's similarly with regard to symptoms, I've known guys to talk about, what's next. You could tell that they were nervous in effect. And much of it really was associated with who they were, what their background was, what kinds of ways they approach frightening situations or complicated situations for that matter. So I learned a lot about human behavior and endurance and resilience also at the same time. But it's remarkable how we all, as warfighters, we play games with ourselves to try to, reassure ourselves that everything's okay, that things are going to work out. The whole notion of depending on a buddy is extraordinarily useful and important. But the thing that was always weird was the fact that we were wondering, are we okay? Because if you ask someone, what are they going to say? Oh, sure, you're fine. But it isn't normally very fine.
No, it isn't. And, we'll be covering the whole issue about stigma in the military and, what do people feel comfortable talking about, even acknowledging is something that, it creates what we refer to as a ceiling effect in terms of how much are people willing to disclose. And, as far as any kind of struggles they're having as a result of their exposure to extreme or traumatic stress. And I was sharing with you earlier, I was meeting with a general officer recently, and that person, had several decades of service and multiple deployments, to Afghanistan and Iraq, and was just at that moment I saw in this 1 hour visit, first time really talking about what his experiences were and how it's affected him, and acknowledged that it was not something that he could even allow himself to think about, and certainly would never discuss with his peers, due to the how that would affect his career and how people would perceive perceive him, and how he would perceive himself. So, I mean, it causes a huge ceiling effect. So when we talk about statistics, and if people read about statistics of the prevalence rates of PTSD or suicide or depression or TBI, any of these conditions, that you have to understand that it's probably an underreporting, because a lot of people just don't report it for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, there's no benefit more often than not.
Yeah.
You have your pride, you have your sense of safety and security, and a person of respect, et cetera, and you don't want to tarnish that, quote unquote. But
sure,
it's interesting. There are numbers of friends of mine that I've known within the military and following military, and to live with these kinds of symptoms and to not be able to do something about it. And of course, the worst thing is you tell a buddy and they say, hey, you can stop it. And they're worse than anyone else.
yeah,
We would assume. But it's been, rather frustrating in terms of your, sort of holding yourself together during the time of your service.
yeah,
And then being reassured that everything is going to go away and be okay eventually. And for me, I think what happened is that I got very, very busy in terms of school and really didn't have time for anything else. So that probably, it was a good thing, I guess, for me, at least.
yeah. I think for a lot of us, we get on with our lives, and you talked about resilience, for example, and I think there's a real misnomer about what resilience really means. That I think in the general lay public, they think of resilience means that you come out unscathed, right? So in the case you go to war, you deal with a lot of exposure to some real ugly or scary events, and then you're not really bothered by those things that you've seen, or people that you've lost, or what you bore witness to. And that that's the idea of resilience, is that you have no psychological, no physical problems from that experience. But that's really not resilience, what we mean by it, right?
Yeah.
The term resilience, from our perspective, is one of bouncing back, is the hardiness to keep going, to persevere despite suffering. It's not the absence of suffering. It's that, like you just said, you just go forward with your life. You just kind of compartmentalize whatever you need to do to kind of get on to the next day. And that's what we do as warriors. When you're in deployment, you're not thinking about those things. Typically, you're focusing on getting through the day and helping you and your buddies survive the day. And it's not until well after the fact, sometimes even after you retire and you have time, you're not as busy in your life, as when those things start to come, those memories really come home to roost.
Well, let me focus attention on page 69 in the book. The most common reason warriors and family members seek care is, let's track mental health injuries. I think that really is the critical thing in terms of the reasons why warriors seek care. They're concerned about these mental health injuries as wartime casualties, like physical injuries.
Right.
I know that it's a fuzzy area when determining what should and should not qualify as an honorable war injury, yet the science, along with our dozens of journal articles, reported that there are thousands of unreported and honored trauma injuries. And they need to be honored, and they need to be reported.
Yeah, so the military does an excellent job of tracking in real time what you refer to as casualties, right? These would be people who were either killed in action or wounded in action, or suffered some type of a non-battle injury. And they track those statistics, and you can, on any given day, find out what are the current numbers, if you would, the statistics of that. But what we don't track in that is the psychiatric casualties. however you define it, and even if you're just looking at PTSD alone or something, or a handful of conditions, then at least you're tracking something, but we don't report it. So there's a sense in a way of, if it's not reporting, it's a way to help deny that it really is a problem, for starters. And you'd have to do something about it, right? If it's that information is made public, then of course it's going to invite, well, what are you doing about it? So that, the whole idea of trying to, let's just start tracking psychiatric casualties as a inevitable consequence of war, has been borne out by every war generation, that it ought to be considered an injury, and in most cases a legitimate injury.
Yeah, table 2.4, right? It's page 79. It has a listing, but it's doing exactly what you're talking about.
Well, are you talking about like a prevalence table, or
Yes.
we're yeah, we have a
Right.
lot of those.
Incidence of psychosomatic complaints during World War II.
Oh, right, yeah. So I mean, the whole point, again, that's kind of one of these major categories of war stress injuries that is almost always overlooked and not reported at all.
Yes.
Are these medically unexplained physical symptoms? Again, it used to be called psychosomatic. So yeah, you're looking at, in the Second World War, they went and Army researchers went to these medical wards, and they looked at, people with gastrointestinal, orthopedic, injuries, multiple symptoms, cardiovascular, headache, and genital urinal. And what they did is they compared the prevalence of those medical conditions with whether or not people were involved in combat versus those in non-combat roles. And it's like 80% of those medical wards would fill up with combat. And of course, these would be not the obvious, you were shot and you had shrapnel injury or blast, but these would be kind of more medically unexplained physical pains, unexplained headaches, unexplained gastrointestinal, like today would be called GERD or reflux or irritable bowel syndrome, chronic fatigue, atypical chest pain, cardiovascular disease that can't be explained medical basis. So 80% of these folks with medically unexplained physical symptoms were directly exposed to combat as compared to non-combat troops. So that's just again one piece of the puzzle to look at the physical manifestations of exposure to stress that is not PTSD. It's not captured by PTSD. It's not captured by depression or these other psychiatric diagnoses, but are yet still very real manifestations. Again, these are referred to by many researchers as war syndromes, which are syndromes of physical symptoms. And I think I saw one VA researcher identified something like over 200 different separate physical symptoms that can, you pick your number, that constellation, and that is how we express it individually. But your body's manifesting the stress into these physical symptoms, headaches, irritable bowel, irregular heartbeats, pseudo seizures, autoimmune conditions, chronic pain, chronic fatigue, sleep difficulties, sexual difficulties. And again, those things are not tracked by the military or even the VA as a consequence of war, although we know that these are predictable outcomes of human beings when exposed to extreme stress.
I think one of the key times or eras is when families have become more involved in military life. That, obviously you were a kid and you grew up with that. I was, but definitely families are. So there's no tracking within the military, but there's definitely tracking within the family.
Oh, sure.
And they have complained about these same things. I mean, not necessarily for themselves.
Yeah.
I remember, Zahava Solomon is one of the most celebrated researchers and was in the military in Israel and
Yep.
talked about not necessarily what specifically what we're talking about, but she was the wife also of a soldier and then eventually a veteran, and talked about the challenges that they have had in their own life and attempting to absorb and live with those kinds of memories were challenging. They have survived it, I think, but she talked, I think, very candidly about the experiences they've had just as a wife, not as a major that she was also in when she was in the military. But yeah, families definitely take it. And I think that's one of the reasons, well, it is one of the reasons, one of the main reasons why I became interested in this area is because I was primarily interested in interpersonal relationships, social interaction, etc. And so families were basically my area. And to see the impact that veterans have had within their family, as I started studying veterans, I appreciated so much. If I could tell you a very quick story, I was interviewing a kid and he talked about how he had determined that what he was going through was not normal because his mother came in when he was going to kill himself. He was still living at home. He was in the kitchen, 2 o'clock in the morning, whatever. But she then told him about her experiences of being raped. And the symptoms were exactly the same in terms of the difficulties and challenges. Obviously, the topics were different and there were different cast of characters.
Right.
The notion of how she struggled on her own without telling anyone else was the worst part, she indicated, and how he said that was a turning point for him and sort of getting his act together and talking to other kids, other people his own age and those that he'd served with. And from that came some, very important, social organizations, at least in his hometown. So I'm sure these stories are multiple, all kinds.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah. So I was reading in the Department of Defense some of their healthcare statistics, and this is what some of the things, and we report this too in this chapter, is that mental health is the primary reason for military attrition, why people get out of the military, is the number one cause. It's also the number one reason for why active duty are hospitalized, as well as family members who are hospitalized. Number one reason, right? And for children, the number one reason for being seen in an outpatient basis is mental health. So, yeah, the mental health priorities ought to be, right up there with any physical health condition, because they're comparing this to medical conditions. And again, mental health comes out as number one reason for all these visits and hospitalizations, and reasons for why people are leaving the military are often being separated from the military. So you would think that becomes a priority. And the research that you did, I read your book on, I think it was called Strangers at Home.
Strangers at Home, yeah, it was the second one.
Yeah, which is interesting. It's the name of our documentary too, that we didn't name, but that they ended up naming that, the producers of that film did, without knowing really that that's the title of the book you published, and how insightful and how important that book was to really highlight. I think that was the first book I've ever come across that really talked about the military families, and a very neglected, and continue to be a very neglected part of the whole mental health catastrophe that we experienced.
I know this is off the wall. We haven't talked about this or not, but I was thinking that it's primarily neglected for the enlisted. Is it true also for officers? Are they neglected? Their families, officers and their families, not neglected?
As far as neglecting mental health, or
yes,
I would say at least
worse.
It's not even more. I mean, there used to be a time as an officer that we would be evaluated based on our family members. So if our family members were creating problems on the base, they were the rowdy kids, or they were the indisciplined kids, or they had mental health struggles, substance use, or if our wives or husbands had, some problems with mental health or substance use or behavior, right? It will reflect on officers. So there's still some of that now, especially in the higher ranks, but because it's a lot more political, the higher up you go. But yeah, there's a tremendous amount of neglect across the board, I would say, regardless of status, education, rank, position, etc.
The ones included.
It's the one universal, right? It's no one in war itself is a great equalizer, right? Yeah.
Yes.
It doesn't matter who you are, what your background is, how strong you are physically, mentally, spiritually, is that we all have a breaking point. And that's what the researchers in every generation have concluded. And it's a fact that is undeniable, is that, war is a great equalizer. It humbles all of us.
It was interesting, the Army that has lowered the age to enter the military.
I think Ukraine did that recently.
Yes, that was it. Yes, Ukraine. Yeah. And talking about minds that have not been shaped yet, and about their delicate, and all that sort of thing. It's not really great. It's even worse for younger people.
Yeah. Now they're going down to, I think, age 20 or something like that. So, but you look at the US, the average age is, probably closer to 19 or something as far as the young people coming in.
Mhm.
We recruit them from 17, 18, 19, early 20s, and that makes up the bulk of the enlisted ranks at least.
Well, that's when I went in when I was 18.
Oh yeah. So, in the American Civil War, we had people who were exposed, little drummer boys, right? There were children on the battlefield, and people who were fighting who were 13, 14, 15, etc. And so is one of the lessons learned after the Civil War was age. And the US Army started putting age restrictions on who could enter the military because of the fact that those younger people were more vulnerable than the older folks, I guess you would say.
Well, I thought we would turn our attention to the
Okay.
spectrum of neuropsychiatric diagnoses.
Yeah.
Sounds very
Right.
exciting.
Right term, right?
Now, again, there's a table 2.5. I think it's on page 81.
Oh
So
yeah, my
the
goodness.
prevalence of psychiatric related diagnoses among the duty population, 2000, 2016. What would you say about that? What jumps out at you?
Well, again, the whole classified finding that it's a wide variety of conditions, not a single clinical entity, that really describes, the effects of war stress on human beings. So neuropsychiatry was a term that was used since, before the First World War, and it was continued to be used until after the Korean War. And then they kind of dropped the neural and it became psychiatric at that point. Interestingly, the neuropsychiatric now is becoming a new movement to reintegrate the mind and body, the neural in the psyche together. But the idea is that across, like, this recent generation, when you saw statistics and news reports and military reports about the prevalence of psychological impact of war, it was usually 4 or 5, a handful of psychiatric diagnoses that were being tracked and reported. PTSD, obviously, depression, like major depression, generalized anxiety disorder, and then you have traumatic brain injury. And then they added suicide later on, which is not necessarily a diagnosis, it's more of a behavioral manifestation, right? But the spectrum of psychiatric diagnosis that veterans can come away from who are exposed to extreme, protracted, and traumatic stress is, 30 or more different separate diagnoses. So that table, just here we have a handful again, but let's talk a little bit about it. And I'll nerdy it out. This is in the department in the broad category of anxiety disorders, which includes panic disorder, generalized anxiety, phobic disorder, other unspecified anxiety, etc. There were 683,000 service members diagnosed for anxiety disorders up until 2016, from 2000 to 2016. Adjustment disorders, of which there's different varieties. Over 1 million were diagnosed with an adjustment disorder. Mood disorders, which includes depression and bipolar related disorders, 760,000. Substance use disorders, 506,000. All other mental disorders, which is a broad category of stuff, there was another 685,000 military personnel diagnosed. And then psychotic disorders, 32,000. And I don't know if you're aware of this, Charles, but in Vietnam, the most common psychiatric diagnosis for people who were being evacuated from Vietnam was schizophrenia. Schizophrenia. Now, the chances are that some of those people probably did have schizophrenia because they're all that early, late adolescent, early adult age where that might show up. But the fact of the prevalence rates of schizophrenia were so high, and a population of men and women that were thoroughly screened physically and psychologically come in the military, right? Though some probably came in with predispositions, etc. But a lot of those people were diagnosed with psychotic disorders. And that's always been the case throughout history, is that psychosis has been part of that spectrum, if you would. So they had that. We have somatoform disorders, which like hypochondriasis or symptom illness, etc. And that's another 24,000. And personality disorders, another 81,000. Again, that's not even all the different diagnoses. And you notice I didn't even say PTSD. But then you have PTSD, you have acute stress disorder, you have eating disorders, sexual disorders, intermittent explosive disorder. People are diagnosed for the first time in their life with ADHD. I see that over and over again when they come back off the battlefield and now suddenly they have ADHD. Never had it when they were a kid. So a lot of these diagnostic labels are sometimes inaccurately provided, or they at least demonstrate the wide variety of ways how human beings can manifest their stress responses. And each generation, they have different labels for it. But it's that same phenomena of a wide spectrum, which is why you can't narrowly reduce the psychological effects of warfare to PTSD or 2 or 3 other diagnoses, if you would, because you're missing all the medically unexplained physical manifestations, the war syndromes, and you're missing a broad spectrum of the neuropsychiatric conditions as well.
Yeah.
In a nutshell.
In a nutshell. Well, let's talk a bit about something that I think we touched on before, but the prevalence of traumatic grief reactions, given that war is in and of itself grief in terms of dangers, et cetera, et cetera. What about that in terms of grief reactions?
Well, again, it's another category of condition that human beings can develop when they're exposed to extreme, traumatic stress. Losing a close buddy, whether it's survival guilt that we survive and they didn't, or just the sheer loss amongst the military, but also obviously family members and their loss and their grief. So we don't track it. There is a new diagnosis that was recently adopted in the diagnostic manual in 2022 called persistent grief disorder. So we pathologized it in a way, but at least now there's a label that could be given to start to really track that people might not have or be endorsing PTSD symptoms, but they may have a great deal of grief related symptoms and things that are really affecting their life in that way. And that's no less a sacrifice than having PTSD, let's say. from going to war.
Yeah, we were really lucky. We weren't among the first troops into Vietnam. 65, from 65 to 66 is what my tour was. And it was hard. We didn't really talk about any deaths or any particular specific people. But there were a number of people that I spoke with mentioning that I'd heard that someone had died, and they were welling up and they looked away because they felt uncomfortable. But it was a very natural, normal thing. How can you not react when someone who's been fighting next to you, who is on your side, who is part of the unit, dies and you're upset about it? Why not? I mean, I could never understand that. I have no problem with crying.
Yeah.
But other people do, and I understand that. But it was kind of it. I went away shaking my head numbers of times by the way people react to their own grief.
Yeah.
And concern about how other people are perceiving.
I mean, boy, I saw that, again, when I was working as a military psychologist, over and over again. And, yes, and a lot of that was due to the people losing friends, their combat buddies and during the deployment, but also just not war related. I remember this one particular Marine. He was a gunnery sergeant. It was a mountain of a man. I'm about 6 foot, 6'1" or so. This guy was like 6'8", looked like big, broad shoulders, looked like a wrestler, right? His hand was bigger than my hand fit in his hand like a little kid's hand, right? Huge man, chiseled, hardened, had been to, I think, 4 deployments already, had more than his share of combat experience. But what really broke him down, it would break any of us down, it was heartbreaking, it's going to be hard for me to even tell this story, was that when he got back from deployment, he was working on his car in his base housing and had a car on jacks. And his 5-year-old son was playing soccer in the front yard and kicked the ball underneath the driveway where the car was, lurched up. And then he hit the jacks and the car fell on this boy, his son. And this man lifts this car off this boy, his son, and is holding his son, who's struggling to breathe and is obviously in great peril. And he brings has his wife, yells for his wife to call 911, and he's staying there with his son as the paramedics come, and he rides with his son in the ambulance to go to the ER. And the whole time, he's telling me this story, and I'm choking up already. His grief was so palpable and loud, intense, that it reverberated in me. As you can see now, I mean, this happened over 20 years ago. But so this gentleman who was just beside himself, and as a parent, of course, I am thinking of my kids and all that, and traumatic grief. And so I'm dealing with his grief vicariously, and it's affected me. And how's he doing with his? So there are all different ways that we experience grief, and it's normal and it's human and all that. And sometimes, though, it can stick with us in ways that are not healthy, and it can be very counterproductive. And for this gentleman, he was on a very bad path after that happened. But yeah, traumatic grief, again, that's not something that we talk about. It's something we experience. All of us at some point will lose people close to us. But yeah, that's a hard one to talk about, like you just saw me as I'm trying to talk about it.
I remember when I started my academic career, people started figuring out or learning that I was in the Marine Corps. I didn't really advertise that anymore, but I was invited to a number of universities, colleges in Indiana within driving distance of Purdue. But nearly every time out of the maybe 4 or 5 of those that I did early on, there were veterans there. And many of them, I recognized them, of course, by hats, and sometimes they had the uniform on or whatever.
Yeah.
But they trusted me. They had a sense that I got it, that I understood. And that was, in the early 1970s. And it was just beginning in terms of our understanding and our appreciation. And that's really, it started out in terms of my work as interviewing as many men and women as I could, mostly men actually, in terms of their experience. And it was helpful and useful, but when I'm presenting and someone says, "You interviewed me," or something to the effect that I was there and you remember blah blah blah, it was, I felt during that period of time that I had this knowledge that a lot of people wanted and needed, and I wasn't quite sure how to get it to them because it's a different place than we are now. And I was pretty young and I was just starting out as an academic, but those presentations, kind of in my area, my sphere around Purdue University, and the interviews that I did the year after that was, it had a profound effect. And I think that accounted for my sticking with this topic as long as I have. I mean, in my book series, we have 47 books, I think, by now, and there's 8 of them focused on war and vets, and almost all of them, at least the most recent ones, focused on the vet, but also those that are counseling vets, because they also have problems, and especially if they're a vet themselves.
But like as a mental health provider and a military mental health provider, I've said this before in one of our films. It's like I had no education, no training on things like moral injury or even traumatic grief. That wasn't concepts that were taught in graduate school. That wasn't something that was part of my military clinical internship that I went through, and training and orientation to become a military psychologist. The psychological effects of killing and witnessing, interpersonal violence and perpetrating interpersonal violence, right? Those were not topics at all that were discussed. And yet those were the reasons why people often came to my office, because they were struggling with those things, those issues. They were looking for, somebody in a uniform or had an officer that we would somehow symbolize experts. And so many of my mental health colleagues who try their best and do Herculean efforts, but are not really understanding like the physical manifestations of stress and trauma, the whole category of medically unexplained symptoms we talked about. Now we're talking a little bit about traumatic grief, and then we'll touch on moral injury and other things like that. Those aren't things that as healthcare providers we're even aware of. So how do we help people talk and deal with that who come to us? So that's been an ongoing struggle for me as well when I was both in service and retired.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I first started and published on practitioner stress and trauma, et cetera, it was unusual for anyone to choose that as a topic. Now it's everywhere.
Yeah.
I'm very happy about that, because we need to face the reality that we hurt too.
Yeah. Oh, no question. And you just saw an example of that, how I, immediately start breaking down, and I cut myself off to not let it go where it could go, where it has gone. And there are stories like that by the thousands that people like us, bear witness to that type of human suffering, and what's the effect on the caregiver, whether it's a provider or a family caregiver, which we'll talk about in our next episode a little bit more about caregiver distress again, a whole nother area that's not tracked, but it's part of this mental health crisis that there's a ripple effect that goes far beyond just the veteran themselves and who's, impacted by this unmet need and our inability to really appreciate the full implications of the effects of war on human beings and their families.
I agree. So that's going to be next. But the interesting thing with regard to this particular chapter is the struggles, what we've already talked about it, in fact, and we'll talk more about it in the next episode. So
yeah, so maybe this is a good place to kind of end it, and then we'll come back in the next episode. We'll talk a little more detail, get into the weeds a little bit more about, again, this full spectrum of mental health crisis and largely unmet and unrecognized needs that exist. So until then, and if you want to send us feedback, by the way, please, you can email me at mrussell, phd@gmail.com. And if you have any questions or comments for Charles or I, we will love to hear from you. And then, if it's something that we can bring in a future topic, we can drill down on that as well.
Yeah, that would be great if they could write us. Yeah, we want to hear from you. Does this resonate? All right, see ya.
All right, until then, adios.